Autistic Tony Stark by ajexists. Work 4. Proud of the struggles. I'm sure you've all picked up by now that the kid is me, the man is me. I was talking about my life. And, well, after talking to the autistic person, doing research of my own, and seeing a psychologist, I am autistic. Steve watched from his TV, his eyebrows furrowed. Autism? Now what could that be? He turned off the TV to think. The world had changed immensely since he came out of the ice. So many new things Steve had to get a grasp on. Technology was one of the toughest ones. Even years after waking up, he still doesn't feel like he 100% understands it. The collective mind has changed too. He was more open-minded than most back then, but it shocked him the first time he saw a black man go into a restaurant with his white girlfriend. One thing he didn't expect were all of the new words he had to learn, modern-day lingo. Some of it were random references to movies or TV shows he hadn't seen, which a good chunk had been resolved by now. There were many new scientific discoveries since the 40s. He read up on some of the more simple stuff, like new vaccines and of course the internet, but left the complicated stuff to people more qualified, aka smarter, than him. But there were many new words, terms, labels he didn't know either. Of course, some of them existed when he was growing up. He knew some gay people. He heard stories of fellas dressing like chicks. But the LGBTQ+ community and all that it means, what it meant to have pride in something that, for Steve, didn't feel like that long ago, was illegal. He had no clue how or why. Which brings him back to Tony. Tony confused him, to say the least. Steve thought he'd be a lot like Howard, a brilliant and charming man, one who helped him become him. And yeah, Tony was like that too. He had a lot of charm and was certainly a genius, wearing it like a badge of honour, but he also had these quirks. Quirks that irked Steve more than he could ever imagine. He was always moving, having to constantly remind him to stop tapping a pen or spinning his glasses at debriefings. The lack of eye contact always bothered Steve, always taking it as a sign of disrespect. Back when they lived with each other, it seemed like they always had to keep watch of their landlord. He would go days, sometimes even weeks without leaving the lab, only occasionally seeing himself to get coffee. His lack of self-preservation, never taking himself or others seriously, and his massive ego, which, according to the press conference, according to Tony himself, is due to a thing called autism, something he has never heard of before. From how he described it, it sounded miserable. It was a condition that made him cry, that made him very lonely. It seemed like a struggle, poor Howard trying to get Tony to wear clothes only for him to scream. Does autism cause pain? He did mention seeing a psychologist, so it is a mental condition of some type. Steve thought back on all these quirks, all of these things Tony described in his press conference to be part of his condition, all of the arguments they have, the fights, from the almost daily, look at me in the eye when I speak to you, even to their battle in Siberia, how he couldn't get Tony to listen. As soon as the emotions hit, he went on the attack. All of this was due to his autism, and he has announced it to the world like someone would announce them having cancer. It was a very brave thing to do. It was only a few months of the Avengers being broken up before the UN and the government realised that they can't have half of Earth's mightiest heroes in jail, so they revised the accords that both sides were willing to compromise on. The rogue Avengers were pardoned, and before they could all go out saving the world, they now had weekly meetings going over each section of the accords so that they would all understand the agreement. This was their first meeting after the press conference, and if things weren't tense before, they certainly were now. They all sat in their usual spots. Steve's seat was at the head of the table so he could see all of his teammates, except for Tony, who always sits in the chair behind him. When Steve walked in, he was already in there, lowering his eyes to look at his hands. He had some colourful, square-shaped toy he was playing with. Tony just seemed to notice Steve was there. He gave his usual greeting of a single nod and looked back over at the wall just behind Steve, over his shoulder, like he usually did. Steve furrowed his brow, then pointed at the toy and asked, "What you got there?" Tony bit his cheek and looked down at the toy. "It's a poppet fidget. My intern got it for me." Steve furrowed his brows even more. Wasn't finding his condition supposed to help him stop these behaviours? He did only just find out, though, going through a learning curve. Steve nodded, then said, "Make sure it doesn't cause a disturbance." Tony scoffed a little, eyes now fully focused on the poppet. "I'll make sure of it, Cap." Steve wanted to say more, but at that point Ross came in to start the meeting. He sighed and went back to his seat. Throughout the meeting, Steve kept glancing back at Tony. He always did this, wanting to make sure Tony was paying attention to what Ross was saying. But now there was a sense of curiosity, seeing how Tony would be in these meetings now that he knows of his condition. He thought that he would change by sitting properly in the chair, not moving around so much, making eye contact when someone was talking. Come to find out, he did none of that. Every time he looked back, Tony was seated in a new and weird position. The poppet he brought was being put to good use, being constantly played with. At least this toy was quiet, unlike Tony's previously well-used pen tapping. And with the eye contact, half the time he was looking anywhere other than Ross, and if he was looking towards him, Steve could tell it wasn't direct eye contact. He started to grow a little frustrated. He thought that by discovering and announcing his condition to the world, it was going to draw an end to these behaviours, yet here he still was actively doing them. Steve had to keep reminding himself that this was all new to Tony. He thought back to when he was sick, before the serum. With every new sickness came another bone-crushing, sometimes quite literally, reminder that he was not going to get better. After the serum, even though he was almost immediately thrusted into being a soldier, being Captain America, it took him some time getting used to not being ill. He had to remind himself how to breathe sometimes, not being used to being able to take larger, deep breaths with his previous reduced lung capacity. One thing that helped then was having support, knowing someone was there to help him through the difficult times, who never gave up on him even when they didn't know if he'd survive. His ma, Peggy, Bucky. So maybe he just had to be that for Tony. After a few hours, the meeting was over. The rest of the Avengers were leaving with whispered small talks, Tony trying to rush himself out as usual. This time, however, Steve walked beside him. When Tony turned to look in his direction, he flinched back, not expecting to see him. Steve took a step back, then asked, "Mind if we talk for a couple minutes?" Tony squinted and stood there in silence for a few seconds, seemingly pondering at the situation in front of him. Eventually, though, he nodded and said, "Okay." Steve smiled at him. "I want to start out by saying I watched your press conference." He watched as Tony visibly stilled. "I wanted to tell you how brave you are." Tony's face immediately turned to confusion. "Huh?" "Yes, brave," Steve smiled wider. "Coming out and telling the world about a condition like that must be challenging." "Where exactly are you going with this?" Tony looked up at him and moved one of his hands up to his chest, tapping it in circles much like he did when he had the arc reactor. "Because I'm not really liking where this is heading." Steve took a deep breath, keeping his frustrations down. "What I'm getting at is that I want to support you." Tony stopped his movements. "Support me?" "Yes, Tony, support you." "Support me with what, exactly?" "With your condition, helping you try to fix it." Tony glared at Steve, taking very slow and calculated breaths. "Fixing it, huh?" Steve looked up and raised his hands in bewilderment. "Yes, Tony, what are you not understanding?" "No, I don't think you understand," Tony interrupted, taking a step closer between them. "I don't need fixing, Cap. There is nothing to fix." No, I do understand. I may not have had your condition." "Would you quit calling it a condition?" "Would you quit interrupting me?" Steve spoke. Tony flinched and looked down, going back to playing with the poppet. Steve sighed, this time not bothering to tell him to look up, and continued. "I may not have had autism, but I did have a lot of illnesses growing up, and there were many times where I almost gave up hope of finding a cure." Tony stilled a little, eyes widening. Steve kept going. "Most people felt like there was no use in me even trying to get better, that I should just stay in my house and die." He swallowed the lump in his throat. "But because of my ma and Bucky, I kept going. I kept fighting. And after the serum, Peggy was there to help me get used to my new normal. Tony, I want to help you get used to your new normal and to get better. Tony stood there in silence, the only sounds being the rapid tapping of his foot. He then shook his head and said, "Nope, I'm out." Steve rolled his eyes as he saw Tony rushing towards the door. He followed quickly behind, reaching out to grab him. "Stark, it's incredibly rude to walk out on—" He got a hold of his wrist. Tony gasped and flinched. Pulling his arm away, he growled at Steve. "Don't you fucking touch me." He was now borderline running to the door. Steve shouted at him, "I am trying to have a meaningful conversation with you." "Good luck next time, Rogers." He slammed the door. Steve stood there, rubbing his face and groaning. He stumbled back over to the chair and sat down with a sigh. "Well, that went well." No, it did not. He jumped and looked over to the source of the voice. On the other side of the room, hidden in the corner, was Natasha. He put his hand on his heart and said, "Christ, Nat, I didn't know you were back there." Natasha came out of the corner and walked over towards Steve. "I heard you saying you wanted to talk to Stark, so I stayed to make sure nobody said anything stupid and didn't get hurt, considering the last time the two of you were alone." Steve winced at the reminder. "And?" "Well, nobody got hurt." She grabbed a chair and moved it to sit in front of Steve. "But I believe some stupid stuff was said." Steve huffed. "Yup, kinda figured that." He looked up at Natasha. "So what was it?" "Did you watch the press conference?" Steve squinted his eyes. "Yes, I literally said that to Tony." "No," Natasha said. "I mean the whole thing. Did you see him finish the speech and walk off that stage?" Steve thought back to that night, playing it through in his head. He remembered Tony saying, "I am autistic." Then he turned off the TV to think. He was still on the stage when he said that. He bit his lip and shook his head. "I turned it off after he confirmed his condition." Natasha nodded like she expected to hear that answer, quickly pulled out her phone, which had the video on screen. "Watch it again, and finish it this time." Steve rolled his eyes with a smirk and pressed play. He briefly listened to the same dialogue he watched before, Tony talking about his childhood, the same lonely and sad story of a kid who found pain in existing. He glanced up at Natasha sometimes, being met with a blank expression. He then got to the part he stopped at. "And, well, after talking to the autistic person, doing research of my own, and seeing a psychologist, I am autistic." He watched as the crowd shouted, demanding both questions and answers, but then he saw Tony silence the crowd and continued. Steve listened as he explained about the document leaks, how he had had a meltdown and wished he could just be normal. "There are days where I hate being autistic, wishing I could have just been normal, but most of the time now, I am proud to be autistic." Steve's eyes widened in shock, looking up at another expressionless Natasha. Proud? He was proud to have this. Why would he be proud to have a condition that has caused this much suffering in his life? "You are not broken, you are not a burden, not a mistake, a freak, none of that. You are just autistic, and that's okay." Autism can be hard. This world was not built with neurodivergent people in mind, but trust me when I say being authentically you is the most freeing thing in the world. One day you'll be out and free, and you can find the people who love you for you, not some mask you put up. The unmasked, real you is great. You are great, and we've got this. The video stopped and Steve silently handed Natasha back her phone. They sat there quietly pondering for a while. Then Steve said, "I don't understand. How could he be proud of this?" "I don't understand either," Natasha said quietly. Steve looked up at her sympathetically. Not understanding something was one of the few things Natasha was afraid of. In the Red Room, if anyone behaved like Stark was describing himself, they were deemed defective and killed on the spot. There was no room for error. But he is proud of it. He doesn't want to get rid of it. He said that he was miserable before he knew, when he had to hide his behaviours, and now that he doesn't have to hide, he's happier. "No, I don't understand, and maybe I never will, but I want to understand him." She looked up at Steve. We hurt him a lot. We have a chance to work with him again, and I don't want to mess that up. Steve nodded. Me too. He ran a hand through his hair, then asked, So what do we do? Natasha shrugged. Talk to him, try to understand why he's proud of it, see what we can do to help him. Steve opened his mouth to talk, but Natasha quickly put her finger up. We ask him what he wants us to do, not assume based on past experiences of ours. Steve chuckled and nodded. Okay, I get it. He smiled and got up. Thanks for the help. Natasha got up too, smiling back at him. Any time, Steve. A few days later, Steve was in the living room of the compound reading a book. He wanted to talk to Tony about his conversation with Natasha, but didn't know exactly when or how to approach it. He had a feeling he wouldn't be able to just pull him aside for a conversation after the next team meeting, seeing as how the last one went, so he spent the last few days either distracting himself or trying to come up with a plan. Friday announced over the loudspeaker, Captain Rogers, boss will be arriving soon to talk. Before Steve could even process what it said, Tony walked through the doors. He set down his book and stood up, walking over to him. Tony, me first, Tony interrupted. This time Tony seemed to have a stress ball on him, tossing it between his hands. He stopped the tossing and pointed at Steve. You're an arse. Implying that I don't understand my own diagnosis, comparing myself to you, saying that I need a serum to fix my brain. That's fucked up. Steve crossed his arms. That's not what I said. Tony raised his arms in surrender. Fair. That's how I heard it, though. He started wandering around the couches, the classic Tony Stark walk and talk. That shit hurt. But maybe I should have stayed. He glanced over at Steve. Maybe I could have said that I needed 10 and come back. Could have maybe explained some things that were clearly misunderstood. That would have been smart. He stopped in front of Steve and said, And I am very smart. Steve chuckled, shaking his head and looking down in disbelief. Oh, you don't think I'm smart? Tony smirked, going back to tossing the ball between his hands. You wound me, Cap, my best attribute. Steve put his hands up with a smile. Again, not what I meant. He looked back up at Tony and said, I talked with Natasha after, come to find out that I didn't actually watch the entire press conference. Now that would have been smart. Well, I'm not known as a genius, am I? Steve smiled and took a deep breath. I didn't understand, I still don't understand, how you can be proud of it. To me, when I grew up, having any sort of illness was frowned upon. You either had to get fixed or were shunned away, and clearly the world has changed a bit. He heard Tony snort. I want to understand. The things I said very much upset you, and we just got the team back together. Steve stopped himself, then restarted. I care about you, Tony, not just as a teammate, but as a friend, and I know I've made a lot of mistakes on that front. He saw Tony look away from him. He took a deep breath. I want to make things right with you, with us, and this seems very important to you, so please explain to me so I can understand. The two stood in silence for a while, and Steve added on, In simple terms, again, I'm not a genius. Tony laughed and rocked in place a little, a bit grateful that Steve was giving him the time to think about what to say. Once he figured out the words, he said, Autism isn't an illness. If anything, it's a disorder, since its full title is Autism Spectrum Disorder, but I prefer you didn't call it that either. Steve nodded and asked, What should I call it then? Tony smiled a little, looking up. Just autism. He took a deep breath and continued. Autism is a neurodevelopmental disorder, which in simple terms mean that my brain was created and developed differently. It's not a sickness looking for a cure, it's just whatever genes my mom and Howard had to create me wired my brain in a way that caused me to develop this way. Steve bit his cheek to think about what Tony said. So, you were born with autism? Yes, I was born like this. Tony smiled a little and shrugged. There's also a whole debate about person-first language versus identity-first language I could get into with you right now, but I'll spare you the details. I'm sure you'll tell me about it another day. Definitely. The two men chuckled and went to another round of silence. Steve broke the silence. I still don't fully understand how you can be proud of it. I may have accidentally skipped the end of your speech, but I heard you tell your story. It sounded mostly miserable. How and why are you proud of it? The pride is honestly a bit of a social justice thing, if I'm honest, Tony chuckled. I think it's less of actually being proud you have a disability. Steve's eyes widened with shock, and Tony smirked. Yes, Cap, I said disability. Scary word, I know. Tony continued. It's less of being proud of having a disability, and more of just owning it. For pretty much the entirety of humankind, really in nature in general, it's survival of the fittest. You're different, you're shunned, like you said. Disabled people were always seen as less than, even today. The world is more progressive than ever, and there are still people out there who believe that if you need a wheelchair, you shouldn't even leave your house. Tony looked up at Steve. You could understand this, Cap. Steve squinted his eyes. What do you mean? Before the serum, you said it yourself. People saw no point in you trying to find a cure. You had chronic illnesses. You were disabled, Steve. Tony shrugged. Too bad super soldier eugenics got the better of you. Steve rapidly shook his head and waved his hands in front of him. Wait. Slow down. You're throwing too many bombshells at me at once. He ran a hand through his hair. And why do you keep throwing around that word? Disability and being disabled is not a bad thing, Cap. Believe me, I get it. When I heard I was disabled, I felt terrible about it. Tony looked up at him. No one wants to be disabled, but we can't let ourselves be scared of a word. He smirked and shrugged. It's just a word. Steve took a deep breath and walked over to the couch, sitting down and waving an arm out. Go on. Tony sat in the chair across from the couch. To get back to my point, disabled people have been shamed for existing for years, and it got to the point where people just had enough and decided to be unapologetic about it. The whole point of being prideful about your disability isn't to be like, I'm so happy to have something that causes me to have sensory issues and meltdowns and struggle in social situations. It's really to say, fuck everyone for telling me to be silent. I exist, and I deserve to be thought of the same as everyone else despite my struggles. And who knows, maybe you will actually find some good things. What good things? Well, in my case, my autism makes me an incredibly passionate person. I was able to get good at engineering to the point where I created my suits and synthesized a new element. Stimming is nice. Stimming? Pacing, tapping, waving my hands around. Basically think of any weird movement I do that irks you. That's stimming. Steve looked down with a hum, feeling a little ashamed. There are probably some positives to your disability too. Steve looked up at him with a slight glare. What do you mean? Think about your sense of justice, your strong moral code of what's right and wrong. Sure, yeah, some of that probably came from your mom, but your illnesses gave you a reason to fight, Tony said. It showed you firsthand how rude people can be, and you wanted to put a stop to it. That's a big part of who you are as a person. Huh. Steve never thought of it like that before. He thought back at his time before the serum with a bit of disdain. Yes, he thinks about the time he had with his ma, or growing up with Bucky, but he wished that he was healthy then so his life could be better. But after everything Tony said, yeah, he still likes that he is healthy now, but he thinks he can learn to not hate little unserum Steve. He was fighting for his life during a time where no one believed in him, and that time made him who he is today. Steve looked up at Tony with a smile. That was good, very thoughtful. Tony shrugged and smirked. What can I say? Genius. Steve chuckled and stood up, Tony soon following. The two walked over to each other and shook each other's hands. Thank you for explaining, Tony. Of course. Tony smiled and let go of his hand, heading towards the door. Please ask Friday for some articles or videos, something for you to do your own research. Steve chuckled. I will. Oh, and one more thing. Tony stopped him at the door and turned around to face him. Whatever you do, don't use the term Asperger's. And why's that? It was created by a Nazi. Well, fuck that guy. Hi, I hope you enjoy the podfic. If you do, please consider subscribing as I try to upload at least twice a week. It really makes my day. I'm taking requests, so if you have a favourite fic you would like covered, drop me a comment and I will reach out to the author for you and I will credit you for the suggestion in the description. Have a lovely day.